Well, like a buddy of mine who has sort of retired, and retired not of his own volition. Everybody in our business, except creators at a high level, and by that I mean photographers, directors of photography, directors, etc., even grips, in the big end of the pool, where you are working on $200 million shows, you can die in this job and it's fine. If you're still competent and you have a core knowledge of institutional knowledge and you're not phoning it in or you're not pretending you're better than you are, you can work until you drop dead. And there are guys and girls who do that. Producers, editors, everybody. In the middle and shallow end of the pool, where I reside, and that's not to say I don't work with very talented people, but I intentionally stopped working on movies and TV shows. I don't have anything to do with that. I love, it's a dynamic, amazing environment, but I really don't want to do it anymore and haven't for a long time.
Why is that?
Because it would ruin my family. I knew that doing TV shows, the last job I said no to, or the first job I said no to for a season was The Wire. So the TV show The Wire was in town. It was the first season, and the key grip asked if I wanted a dolly grip on it because I was dolly gripping a lot. And I thought about it for a day. My wife was about to have our first child. And I'm like, no, I can't do that. And the reason was, and it was a little bit of a cheat. I knew it would be really hard. I had worked on the TV show Homicide. And that was a tough grind. Seasons of TV are a really tough grind. Feature, you work for usually 70 to 90 days and you're done.
What do those days look like, though?
They're tough, but they're also
like
more measured.
How long?
You're talking typically on a show that's well run, 12-hour, 13-hour days, 5-day weeks. At one time, it was a lot of 6-day weeks. It's not the case anymore.
You do the math, that's like 50, 60-hour work weeks.
Yeah, 60-hour work weeks is pretty common. And
that's
that's from the time that you like plant yourself down at work, then your commute. So you're gone a lot of the week.
70 hours almost, yeah.
But the stress level's typically lower. If you're working in a crew that's good and that doesn't have a lot of internal division, that's a dynamic, enjoyable work process where you're building something every day and taking it down. So you're building a circus tent every day and you're putting all the lions and stuff in there and the elephants and the ringmaster, and then you take it down again. That's really fun, and it strokes your ego. It's dynamic. You have a good amount of camaraderie with a lot of people. There's a flow to it, which is really, really enjoyable.
You kind of become like a family almost.
You become like a family, a weird family of people that don't work normally in other places. But
that's for some people. Some people like that.
Oh, yeah.
But so going back, you said your wife was about to have your first kid.
Yeah, so like that's great, but then I looked at like all of that, and you build skills, and maybe you work towards something great. You work on that show and like, hey, I dolly grip on this, then maybe I do this, and then you see 5 years down the road, like anybody else sees in a career, like if I'm an internal salesperson, then I go out and I do external sales. Maybe I could become a sales manager and then become like the chief sales officer, whatever. In our world, it's, you might move up the chain or move into bigger shows. When I looked at that point, I'm like, okay, I lived in LA before I got into business, and I'm not moving back there to have kids because LA's insane. And I want to have kids and know them, and I want to not be divorced. And like, I thought, if I do this show, it means I'm going to be effectively gone for 8 months. And gone, I mean like you're home for a day and a half each weekend, and it grinds you down. And I knew from Homicide, it's going to be working in really tough areas of town where the stresses would be there and all that. So I looked at that and I was like, I don't want to do that. The downside, or the reason why I could do that is my wife worked a 9 to 5, and she made good money, and she had good vacation and insurance and all that. I had the luxury of being able to say no to that job and still get commercials and make a decent income, but not what I would have made. Like, cut it by at least a third what I was doing versus working on that TV show and health insurance and all the rest. But I thought, I don't want to do that because I think I'm going to ruin my marriage if I do that. I think I'm going to become a different person. I don't know if I'm capable of it, but I think it would wreck me. And I thought, my wife is more capable of doing this job she's doing. It doesn't eat her alive as much, and she's frankly stronger than I am. So I sort of inadvertently threw my wife under the bus by her, and it was a partnership, but she also recognized that couldn't do that. So anyway, long story short, I made the decision not to do it. She stayed at work. It was really hard on her, but I think it probably helped our marriage, because I think I would have really suffered badly. And I really wanted to be a dad more than anything else. Like, I really, really wanted to be a father and to help raise kids. And I could be.
Since when? When did you?
I
when did
think
those
I
thoughts
was a
come into your
kid.
head?
As a little kid, I just always thought I'd have kids. It's like I was an unusual like teenager. I was like, yeah, kids would be awesome. And then when we got married, I had the same experience everybody else, particularly in this world, does now, where it was great. We have a great life. We can travel. We went to London every year for a few, for 5-6 days. We did whatever. We didn't have tons of money, but we saved effectively, and we did all this stuff that we wanted to do. And we went back and visited friends in LA, and it was really cool and having a good time. And so all those things were in place. And then my wife one day is like, we should really talk about whether we are having kids, because we always assumed we would. And then we stopped talking about it. And here we are 6 years later. We're 28, and we got to figure out and I was like, yeah, I don't want to be 35 and talk about kids. I don't want to have that conversation then, because to me, the train's already left the station. I want to have enough kids that they can be each other's world. And so I was like, yeah, okay. And then I thought about it, and I was like, oh my God, I could give this up. This is all fun, but I'm of the mind that if you stuck me in Nebraska, I could make a go of it, right? You can do whatever. And so at worst, having kids would be tough, but enjoyable. And at best, it could be this amazing thing and something that I value extremely from my own family experience, from my upbringing.
Yeah.
So it's let's do that. And then we decided at 28, 20, we want to have kids. And that was really hard.
So for anyone out there that's contemplating or thinking or doubting, do you have any sort of in those moments because you especially in today's days, you kind of decide when. I mean, of course there are accidents, so. but
yeah, it's a much
generally
speaking.
Yeah. So is there any sort of advice for somebody that's kind of thinking about having kids and what it'll do and change? And
I mean, the biggest advice, and it's a very commonly held advice from people my age, older guys and girls with kids, particularly guys, I think, is that besides the fact that it's I think an inherent lie that you have to have X amount of money to have kids, the idea that you need to live a complete life according to sort of modern Western civilization standards, which means I need to have visited this number of countries, I need to have had these number of experiences, I need to really wring out what life has to give me before I have kids. I think that's fundamentally false. That you can have kids at any time and it be worthwhile. I grew up with people in a rural place, occasionally would make a mistake and have a kid at 17. And there are ones that it was a disaster, and there are ones that were life fulfilling and wonderful. There's no right time to have kids, and there's no right circumstance to have kids. And people are unbelievably strong and able to cope with what life gives them. And so just have kids. Don't think about it. Don't overthink it. And don't get to the point where it's like, okay, now I can have kids. Because by the time you get there and you're 32 years old and you start trying to have kids, first of all, it's more difficult. It just is. You're most fertile when you're 18 or 17, 16. But additionally, waiting just means that you're putting off what will be an amazing experience. If you just really give yourself up to having kids, it's incredible. So don't wait, and don't let humanity decide for you that it's appropriate when you have kids. Don't let your friends and other people, oh wow, you're really going to have kids already? As if you're making some giant mistake because you haven't yet been to Thailand. It's like, sorry, man.
It sounds like there's always going to be boxes to check off if you're trying to check off boxes before the kids come.
That's right.
Right.
And it's a never ending.
Oh, I got to get the promotion. I got to make more money.
Yeah, and then when I get more money, once I get this next promotion, and once, and it's on both sides, it's moms and dads. It's like, when I make partner, when I do this, when I do that, when I move into this house, and it's like this endless thing. And our first house was a nice house in a nice neighborhood, but it was tiny. It was 1,300 square foot, 2-story house. It was really small. And our kid's bedroom was like the size of a teacup. I don't care. I mean, it really doesn't matter. My wife grew up in a row house with 6 brothers and sisters, and a grandmom living in the house. So think about it. That is parents, grandmom, 7 kids, 10 kids at some point in that house, 10 people in a row house that is 12 feet wide and 2 stories.
With 1, maybe 2 bathrooms.
With 1.5 baths. Half bathroom was put in.
Yeah.
So people can do anything. It doesn't mean that you have to have privation so you have kids. But man, I tell you, there are people who have kids who are happy. They're everywhere on the internet. You don't have to look far on Instagram to find a great account of a family that focuses on their kids and their family and what they do. They're everywhere. and just look at how they live and how they comport themselves with their kids and with the outside world, and you realize like, wow, this is unbelievably fulfilling.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's also very challenging.
No, yes, I'm sorry. It's extremely difficult, but so much, the importance of it is so much greater than whether or not you get that raise.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Unless you're living at like hand to mouth, and then the raise is extreme.
Sure. There's a lot of variables here, but overall, it's like, I hear what you're saying. Let's go back. Let's go to your personal story then. So you got this business, freelancing. You decide to stop working on movies and then to start a family. You said first kid. So how many kids do you have?
3.
You have 3 kids.
Mm-hmm.
Boys or girls?
All boys.
You have 3 boys?
Mm-hmm.
How close in age?
The first one is 3 years older than the second, and then we had close to Irish twins. Our second and third kids are like 16 and a half months apart.
Wow.
That was tough.
What were some of your strategies with raising boys? Because, just a couple things that come to mind, right? Were there any sort of, pushing your kids to do things at all, or teaching them about failure and maybe not being afraid of it, how you treat women? Those are just some things that I'm just thinking about, like, how boys are supposed to be raised, right? Or did you have any thoughts on like, what, I got 3 boys, I want them to, not be scared of anything, or,
right.
What are your thoughts there on being a dad?
I had a situation which wasn't that unusual. I mean, my folks got divorced when I was, I think 10-ish. We had moved a couple times. They were friendly towards one another. My folks, I always sort of liken it to the Bugs Bunny cartoon, which nobody's going to know about anymore, where there's a sheepdog and a wolf, and in the morning they both clock in. And then the sheepdog guards the sheep, and the wolf proceeds to try to like kill the sheep at any means necessary. And the sheepdog just keeps thwarting the wolf. It's funny. And at the end of the day, they clock out, and then they say, good night, Sam, good night, Fred, and they go about their business. My parents were sort of like, they didn't try to thwart each other, but they were just friendly. They were just, going about their day, and they were friendly to each other. I didn't see any real affection. And so that was normal to me. But my mom had an outsized effect on me because I was raised by my mom primarily. And then when my folks divorced entirely because my dad moved to the West Coast. And my mom was like just a good human being who cared about everybody. She read books a lot of other people didn't read about, like the Black experience, or just anything that was like, oh, I should really think about this before I talk about it. And it's not that she felt terrible about who she was or what she did. She just wanted to be a good person and wanted to treat people well. And so when I raised kids, but she came from a broken home. Her father left when she was 5, and she's one of 5 kids, and this was in the 40s. So she had very little to go on to teach her children about how to raise kids other than by example. And so I think that was hard for her, but it was also hard for us. Like, I didn't have a strong father figure in my life. I didn't have anybody to instill in me a sense of resiliency. I was much more nurturing. That's what I had in me, and that's what I was taught by my mom, is the nurturing. And so, like, I struggled with how to set proper boundaries, that at least there was some consequence. But I tried to make sure that my kids could function when they were kind of young. Like, you need to you need to learn how to wash dishes. You need to learn how to wash clothing, to mow the lawn. So we tried to give them chores as they got old enough that we thought they were capable of them, so that when they went into the world, they didn't assume that everything was there for the taking and they had no responsibility. But in terms of like how I just sort of feel like the biggest lack I had was in maintaining order in their lives and forcing them to maintain some sort of order, just so that when they get to be adults, they feel they're ordered, that they're not chaotic, and they can function normally in society without having somebody over them all the time, or just having a life that is just completely incontinent, where just stuff is going everywhere. That's the biggest thing I feel like I lacked, and that's because I lacked it from my folks. Just because that's what you deal with what life deals.
Yeah. And then in regards to your dad,
my dad moved to L.A., and my relationship got better with him or just became something in college. I viewed my dad as like a bank. When my dad came to town, he brought stuff. I was relatively self-motivated as a kid. I liked things. I wanted more stuff. I used to make little lists of like, man, what if I had $1 million? I'd do this with it, and I'd have this cool pool, and I would go to this cool place, you know. And so my dad was like the visiting, you know, like king who would bring me stuff, and then he would leave again. And then through college, I started to sort of revisit that. And I'd see my dad, and it was a really neat thing. And then after college, and I'd have conversations with him about his work. My dad did kind of very high-level work overseas. And I started to enjoy that and be able to talk to him as a man. And he got a lot out of that. And he became much more open. He was very logically driven and didn't understand kids at all. I mean, my upbringing with my dad was a little odd. He would play baseball barehanded, right? He wouldn't go fishing. He wouldn't know how to throw football he just didn't do any of those things. So like as an adult, my relationship really flourished with my dad. And my dad he lives in Maine in a care home as well. And he's awesome. I love my dad. I wish he were here.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, it's great.
Going to you raising your kids, because your dad wasn't really around much, did that change you at all where you're like, you know what, man, I really want to be around for my kids?
My mom never bad talked my father. She always spoke well of him and did not want us to be colored by her relationship with my dad, which was huge. But my mom played such an outsized importance in my life in terms of just trying to be a good person and treat myself well and treat other people well. I really struggled and still struggle, but much less so than I used to, with confidence. I was very, very self-conscious about everything. What people thought of me was enormous, but I was also very self-righteous. That's not exactly a good combination. Tacitly telling people they're doing things wrong and then worrying about what the reaction is not exactly a good way to go through high school and even college. And so I found myself alone a lot, where I'm a pretty big personality. Even though I don't like big groups of people, I really struggle with that. I like intimate groupings. What I found in my life is like the lack of a dad meant that I did not learn some things socially. I didn't learn some stuff that I would have learned otherwise. And so I sort of actualized things because of not having that person. Because my mom was too busy just trying to raise us and make us, my brother and I, get along in some fashion or other, and just to make sure that we didn't kill each other and that we were a family. It didn't have the strength and didn't have those characteristics that a dad has in terms of how you enforce things. And so I just didn't learn a lot of stuff. And so like in terms of how I raised my kids, I never thought about that. I never thought, I knew the things that I had been not lucky enough to have, just by virtue of how I was raised. But it didn't occur to me on an ongoing basis that was going to be problematic, even though it probably was problematic. Like my lack of having sort of regularity and organization and that sort of organizational competence as a father definitely manifests itself in my kids. And I've always been able to see the failings that my kids have, I see in myself, and I see also in how I've raised them. So when my kids would do things that we would have problems with, that we would say, look, we've taught you not to do these things and you're doing them anyway.
Do you have an example?
Okay, so your kid is routinely leaving all the dishes in his room at 14 or whatever. If he goes up and has snacks and then you go to his room and it's like, you can't keep doing this. You have to take them down. But there are no repercussions if he doesn't. Those kinds of things are meaningful. Like kids thrive on regularity in organization and expectations. And so if you set an expectation for a child that if unmet is meaningless, they will continue not meeting that expectation routinely because there's nothing behind it. There are carrots and sticks as parents. And there's a certain amount of moral authority that you have over your child that without it, your kids just are, it's like if you're raised by a wolf, you're going to become a wolf. So if parents act like wolves around their kids, that's what they're going to get. If parents act like taskmasters, they're going to have kids that are fearful, but they follow order like to the T, right? So, for me, it was that a lot of the things that were unmet were because we did not do a good enough job on the enforcement side of saying, look, here are the consequences if you don't do this. And I'm going to make consequences. Like the consequences in life are going to be something entirely different if you are chaotic and disordered. But while you're in my house as a little kid, I can create consequences so that you don't go into the world disordered and chaotic. Those are the things that I think the generations have suffered from over the years. We've suffered from the 1970s and forward with kids who, particularly your generation, I think is the first one, who've really struggled with having that a little more chaos in their world as young adults because they were taught more about the relationship being positive between mom and dad and you, but not so much that you were held to account for things. And it's really important because there's a brittleness there that doesn't exist for the previous generations because like there were definite consequences. And so like they had to deal with them. It's like going in the army. You can't just say, I don't want to dig that hole. If you don't dig the hole, then you're going to go over there and you're going to peel potatoes and you're going to dig that hole. And if you don't do it, we're going to throw you in a jail until you decide to. We're going to demote you. Mm-hmm. If you don't have those kind of consequences as a parent, your kids will suffer grave consequences in the world if they just have no consequences at home. If there are none, you end up with brittle kids who don't know, whose all their moral authority comes from their friends. All their friendships are like, what's really important to me is that Tommy feels this way about me. Well, Tommy really cares about Tommy first because Tommy matters most to Tommy. And Paul matters to Tommy too, but Tommy matters more than Paul does. And so if Tommy can do better in the group by belittling Paul and making himself look really great to his friends, Paul's going to be for it. And Paul has to deal with it. And like, those are all relationships that are transactional. A parent's relationship to me is not transactional, it's foundational. And so if you treat your kids with kindness and respect, but with authority, if you maintain moral authority over your children, I think you will get back like a millionfold when they get to be young adults because they respect you, they respect what you did, and they respect your reasoning behind it, and they understand it. That's my view of parenting as a kid.
How do you do that?
Huh?
How do you do that? That's the big question.
You don't. Well, so I think there's a popular myth in our society and in Western culture more broadly, but really America particularly, because we have more stuff than anybody else. And we have more Targets and Michaels and all that. That they're just going to do it anyway. They're just going to learn from those other people or those other people's kids. And so a good way of, like for me, just a really easy example of like how do you do it is we didn't let our kids watch tween shows. We didn't let them watch any live action shows on Discovery or Disney or Nickelodeon. Because as far as I was concerned, when I'd see those shows, I'd watch a little bit of it. It was all children put into adult situations. So it was 10 to 14-year-olds with adults in the background. They would sort of be tertiary characters that would come in and out, but they weren't really involved other than sort of as foils for whatever these kids want to do. And the kids are walking around with the girls have Starbucks cups and they've got shoulder bags and they're talking like adults, and the boys are like, "Hey man, this is really cool." They're like little adult. They're like 20-year-old men in 12-year-old bodies. They're not out drinking and carousing, but they're all of the actions are sort of just fun jackassery. And I looked at that and I'm like, I think that's a perilously bad example to send to kids, because I want my kids to be children and to act like children and to have expectations of what children have. I don't want adulthood foisted off on them when they're 9, right? Because the other thing about these shows is all these live action shows are made for 9 to like 12-year-olds, and they're all acted by 12 to 16-year-olds. I'm like, man, I just think this is bad. So we didn't let them do it. Well, I had a friend who said, I mean, Chris, they're just going to, when they go to somebody else's house, they're just going to watch them anyway. Well, then a month later, she's like, by the way, when your kids come over and my kids start watching those shows, they leave the room. I'm like, do they? She said, yeah. And they say, we're not allowed to watch that, and they go do something else. And then my kid turns off the TV and they do something else. See, that's moral authority right there. That is my kids respecting my word and my wife's word and what we want and why. Of course, they didn't understand the nuts and bolts. But recognizing that we're more important than their friend when it comes to doing this thing, because we said you can't do that, and we have our reasons, and we want you to respect that. If you go through life thinking that your kids should have to have a perfect explanation and that they're little adults and like you need to make them understand, and kids understand a lot of things, no. Yes, of course you want to explain. You don't want to be an idiot to your children. You want them to learn from you. But the idea that you don't have moral authority, that you're not allowed to, and that, they should mold themselves is, I think it's a very, very false reality. And so that's a little example.
Yeah, no, that's a great
Don't
example.
do this. My kids go over there. They don't do that. There you go. That's how you do
Well,
that.
that must make you really proud. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it makes me happy. It makes me proud. And more than that, it makes me happy that when they go out into life, I see that as young adults, how they act with other people. You said how they treat women. I don't think women are particularly special. I don't think men are particularly. We're both two sides of a coin. We act differently. It's like, psychologists say, 90% of males and females, you have the same cell structures, but that 10% is where the differences lie. Aggression, competence in this, or ability to do something which the other sex maybe is slightly less able to. Whatever those things are, it's not a hard and fast rule. But by the same token, my feeling about treating people a certain way is like, all those shows I just talked about, you always treat the fat kid really well. You treat the kid who's gay really well. You treat them specially. No, you treat everybody well, and you have expectations of them. I've taught my kids, I think, that, look, I don't want you to have separate expectations because this kid identifies as X or this kid is X. I want you to treat him well, but he also has a responsibility, or she, to you, to not expect something because he or she is that thing. I am fat, therefore you have to treat me this way. Not doing that. Sorry. Those are choices you've made, or those are things that life has given you. You need to respect the fact that you have a social contract with the rest of the world. And the social contract falls down when you have a list of things, a list of demands that have to be met by everybody in this room. If you don't treat me this way, this way, this way, and this way, well then, that's too bad for you. Now you're a bad person. And I've tried to teach my kids that is not the way to go through life. Be humble, be appreciative, be respectful, and demand respect of other people. I do the same thing with family stuff. I don't want a pack of wolves as kids. I don't want a pack of wolves that says anybody that's outside of our wolf pack is bad. And so if my son attacks another kid, I don't want his brothers to defend him. Oh, yeah, you're terrible. Yeah, we got to defend him. No, you got to call him out. Yes, you love him unconditionally, but if you're acting poorly, I want you to say to your brother, you're acting poorly towards that person. I don't want this to be about our family is better than yours. I want it to be, we're all great. I love our family. I love what we have, but other people have something to offer too. So give and take, responsibility towards yourself, demand responsibility of other people, and as a social contract, be kind to everybody. Treat everybody well. Try to make your way in the world without making it impossible for anybody else to be friends with you and to respect you.
So you have 3 sons. Did you have any issues with fighting?
None.
People outside, like you said, oh, my brother got in a fight, then So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that, right? So your brother gets in a fight, it's like, that's my brother type thing. What I should say is I should say mistreat. I don't mean like a physical interaction. What I mean is that if you see your brother mistreating somebody else, you should not just stand idly by as they mistreat that person in any way. You should call attention. You should say, dude, stop. Cut it out. That's not cool. The difficulty of that is, as I see it, is that if family is everything and you're unable to honestly examine your family, it doesn't mean you have to air it publicly, but if you can't recognize family members as being problematic and call attention to it and not just ignore it when people bring it to your attention, hey, your brother's out doing this thing to this guy, and you're just well, we can't talk about it because it's a family matter. I think that's a dangerous thing, because I think what happens is you raise people who have a pride about them and about their family that is so important to them that everything else doesn't matter. I don't want that. I want my kids I want them to be proud of their family, but I also want them to be humble. My mother taught humility over everything else. I want them to be humble. Yes, our family, we try to have a good family, but I don't want it to be like a laundry list of why we have a great family and how awesome we are. About that this one lives over here and does this cool job. I'm I don't want that. That's not your job. It's like the Facebookification of the world, right? Hey, this is the cool thing I just did. Our family just did this. Hey, we were just in, last year we went to Europe for 3 weeks. I don't want to trumpet that publicly. That's what I did. I don't want my kids to do that to their friends and be oh, I'm going to create envy in all my friends by saying what we did as a family. I'm not about that, man. I think that's dangerous. And I think that makes people less strong and good. I think it makes them proud, and it makes them a little arrogant, and I fight against that tooth and nail as much as I can. That's great. I like that. Do your kids have social media? I mean, I'm assuming
They
do.
do. They do and they don't. Yes, they do. But primarily it's fun social media. Like, I mean, hell, the youngest one's 19. He doesn't really post anything. My middle son posts. He's a sort of competitive climber, I guess you'd say. He posts stuff on occasion there, but really very little. Most of it's fun, humorous things with other friends. It's very little to do with what they're doing.
Yeah. I guess what I'm getting at is, raising kids in the internet age, social media age.
Boy, is it hard.
Yeah.
I feel for you because you're going through it now. You're a very young person. Yeah. We escaped that. There was no, I mean, when my kids were little, there was no social, of any meaning for kids. No kids had phones. No kids had iPads. They didn't really exist when my kids were really little.
Yeah. Well, we're I'm not too, I mean, I'm worried about it, but it's like right now.
I'm just saying it's just tough.
Yeah, it will be tough, especially the whole
as they get older. Yeah.
Dynamic of being a girl and
very
pictures
much.
And image obsessed.
Yeah.
But I mean, but you still grew up with, I mean, I guess my question is, did you have any sit down talks with your sons about like, this is social media, this is why it can be dangerous, you can use it, but like, was there any sort of that?
No,
or was this a non-issue?
I should have. No, it's not that it was a non-issue. It's that I didn't want to do it. In other words, it was difficult to do, and I shirked that responsibility. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which, as a parent, I can look at what I did and think, I did some really good things. But there are a lot of things like that where I did not have those discussions. I did not say, look, I didn't even sort of, the whole idea of parental controls. I think they're valuable. I think parental controls are good. This whole idea that your kids have a private life and there's sanctity in that privacy would be great if you didn't have, again, I think, a foundational moral responsibility for your children. It doesn't mean that you're in there looking in their lunch bags every day and you're looking at their phone and you're just constantly trolling for data. It is that it's a good thing on occasion. Boys are going to do stupid things regarding sex and alcohol and drugs and things. That's what they're going to do. And it's good to occasionally know what they're doing. Because if you don't, there's such a common thread of parents who were told when the cops show up, like, Dan would never do that. And it's like, you have no idea what Dan would do. You have no idea. Because Dan presents himself to you one way and he presents himself to the world another.
You're talking about Dan as in like somebody's child.
Some kid. Your kid.
Somebody talking about
I have a kid named Dan. I don't. And I say, oh my God, I cannot believe that he would steal from that liquor store. I can't believe he would never steal somebody's car. Well, how do you know? So those are ways in which I should have been involved. My wife and I have talked about it before. It probably would have been a good idea for us to at least see occasionally what's going on to make sure that they're tracking and that we can intervene before things happen. I would like to think that the life lessons we taught them at least were instructive in what not to do. But I know when I was a young kid, somebody's brother or cousin always had porn. Wouldn't be videos, it would be magazines. Always. Somebody always did. And as a 12-year-old boy, I could sit in a room for days looking at that because it's all you care about. It's the only thing that matters to you is girls' bodies. Like, that's it, right? And now that's metastasized unbelievably to a point where you can see anything and you can indulge in anything and you can get interested in any sexual proclivity. And the greatest thing I did for my kids, and I think my wife did, is sit down with them and talk about themselves and girls and guys, whatever, and how to treat yourself and how to treat other people. So I didn't have the conversation about social media, but what I did is sit down more than once and say, look, guys, we're all going to sit here and talk about this. Like, I had girlfriends, you're going to have girlfriends, and I fooled around with them and we did sexual things, but I didn't take advantage and I didn't drink when I was a kid and when I was a teenager. I've never drank, right? And that didn't become a part of the tension sexually with women, with young women. And I tried to treat girls and myself in my relationships that at least I was in a relationship with somebody. I was not sleeping around. I never went to a bar and hooked up with any ever. I didn't want to do that. That was not meaningful to me. What was meaningful is having a relationship and having some kind of sexual relationship. So I tried to explain to them that, look, in the world, you're going to see examples of sex everywhere. And I'm telling you that as a guy who raised you and who has a successful marriage and works and does all the things that everybody else around does successfully, positively, that as much of a struggle as it can be to not have sex with everything that moves and to get trashed all the time, you can do it because I've done it, right?
I think that's really important. Something that I'm learning right now with myself, like in growing personally, is how can I tell her to not go on social media or to not watch TV all the time or to not do all these things if I'm not doing those things.
Yeah.
So that's where you start. Step one is whatever you want from your kids, you need to correct now for yourself. However, what you just said, you're talking about your teenage years. I mean, that's kind of, I would say that's in the minority of most boys. I feel like I was everyone
ostracized.
I knew was drinking.
I was ostracized undoubtedly because I didn't go out and drink. Like there's a certain...
how did that, was it your mom?
Yeah, my mom didn't do any of those things. So my mom had a puritanical, for no good reason, because she wasn't raised with any kind of church at all. But like she really struggled with the self-identity and with the world as a child. I think there are reasons for that. Part of it is her dad leaving when she was 5. She had struggles when she was a little kid, and so she left school when she was in high school. When she was a sophomore, she left in 1940, whatever. And then she and her best friend played in country western bands in bars, like when she was 15. But she did not do anything with guys. Like she was chaste. She didn't drink. She didn't carouse. She had an experience where she actually kept asking a guy, like, why don't you ask me out? And finally he asked her out after months, and it was a guy she was in a band with. And at some point or other, he tried, a little action. Again, nothing that today you would consider, oh my God, he didn't get permission to kiss her. But at some point you have to try to do something. You have to interact. So he tried to interact with her, and she was like, what are you doing? And he said, I was going to kiss you. She said, why? And he goes, this is why I've not asked you out. Because I knew that you didn't know what to do about physical interaction. And he's like, that's why I didn't ask you out, because I knew you'd be uncomfortable with it. And she was like, oh my God. And she still maintained that. But it was a wake up. Then she was like, oh, like this is what, like, that's what's going to happen. So anyway, yeah.
She told you this story?
She told me this story.
I mean, obviously.
When I was a young adult. And it was for her, it was really eye opening. She was like, oh. And she used to tell me when I was a young man, she's like, look, be careful how you are with other people, with women and relationships. She's like, look, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt. She said, if you put 2 people in a dark room and there's a man with a naked woman, unless he's unusual, pretty quickly there's going to be some kind of physical action and probably sex involved if she's interested. If you put a woman in a dark room with a naked man, it's not going to be the same reaction because they just don't think about sex the same way, and it's not about the visual and the, oh my God, I have to have sex right now. She's like, for you, it is a primal instinct, a need, a desire, an urge, whatever, that you need to harness. You need to work with that and create something good out of it instead of just having sex. And I carried that with me all through. I mean, she told me that when I was 15, probably, and I really thought about that. And it wasn't.
That's amazing, man.
I was really. It was very cool that she did that. That's
pretty cool, yeah. So, what about your boys though? I mean, like, okay, yeah. That's a great message, and you lived that message. Yeah. But like, yeah. Did all your boys listen?
I think what my boys did because I even said that to them. I gave them that story of my mom and her exploits. But more than anything else, I think, again, having moral authority over your kids when they're young, where you are their son and they rotate around you, and you maintain the ability to say no and yes and have them listen. By the time they're teenagers, if you've done a good job of that, they do listen to you. And so I have no doubt that my kids are sexually active. But my sincere hope is that my explaining to them that their body is more than a punching bag and that sex is not like eating lunch, which is portrayed in popular culture, and it's portrayed, unfortunately, in sort of like science-y ways as, people who are urbanite and who feel like they, know more than I know, sort of like, hey, look, sex is a thing just like anything else. And you know what? You need to be proud of your sexuality. And I'm like, I can't imagine anything more problematic phraseology than you just need to be proud of your body, and you need to be, you need to have stance, and you need to do this with it and that with it. It's like, man, that's like really revelatory to me about about removing the personhood from sexuality. Like at its core, having sex is procreative. Like that's at the very core. What you do with that is, different religions treat it differently. And then it's also pleasurable. But like that pleasure comes at a cost. Like revealing yourself completely to somebody over and over again, especially if it's a multitude of people, comes with a cost. And one of those costs is you start normalizing that behavior. And then it gets to the point where you no longer are titillated or can be aroused because you've had sex with so many different people that now it doesn't have the same importance that it did when you started doing it. And so you see in our culture, one of the reasons why there are some crazy fetishes. Who is it? The young, she's a singer. She's a pop singer in L.A. She's really huge.
You're asking the wrong person.
She wears really giant clothes. Anyway, I can't remember her name. She came out last year and said, my entire adolescence was dominated by sex. Like I was involved in stuff that was kind of bad, and my friends were kind of not so good. And what I ended up doing is watching porn, and I normalized things that are really bad regularly because it was available to me. And that became sex for me, was like bondage and it was weird fetishes and all these things. And this is a young girl, right? She was like, by the time I became an adult, like sex almost was meaningless to me. Like it didn't carry, I was numb to everything. I was numb to sex. And I'm like, oh my God, that's what I mean. Being numb to that. It's like the most foundational thing you can do with a person is like be with them. And so for it just to be a job that you go out and do, because it's like, hey, this is going to be freaking awesome. I'm just going to have sex and then I'm going to go back to work. It's like, no, man. Yes, you're capable of that. No, you shouldn't do that. There are all kinds of things that you're capable of that you just shouldn't do because they will eventually ruin you. They will deform you. So my kids are sexually active, I'm sure. I know for a fact that they're not sexually active. None of them go to parties and have sex with girls. None of them get drunk and go over here and do this. They all have successful relationships with one person, and that's what they have. I know that from talking to them. I know it. My kids are very self-effacing.
Yeah, and I really like this moral authority you've thrown out a couple of times. I think that's really important.
Well, it's viewed as being bad. The idea of moral, first of all, is like, oh, wait, slow down. Moral. Like, hey, whose morals? Yours or mine? I'm like, I'm just going to go out and say that you have authority over your children because it's your job to. Otherwise, you just are going to raise little wolves that run around doing whatever the hell they want to do. And that's dangerous. They're going to turn into adult wolves. And you can see what happens. You can see how society breaks down when young wolves go out into the world. And then we blame them for it. Young boys are taught everything is your fault. Everything in humanity is your fault. All of society's problems are the fault of men. And it starts young. And I can name you people who I won't, who've told me that this is what they were taught by their parents and society. That, yeah, what I learned is that men kind of suck. My mom taught me that men are sexual beings. She didn't teach me that men suck at all. She was like, yeah, it's unfortunate. You have to harness that. That's what she taught me. Not having a dad meant that I didn't have a lot of confidence, and I elevated women over men. And at some point or other in my 30s, I was like, wait a minute, this is crazy. I've always elevated women. I've always had trouble with like women are awesome because they're somehow better than men. But I had a horrible self-image. And then over time, I've sort of transmogrified that. And I've learned that, no, I mean, I'm a good guy. Like I'm a decent human being and I have value, just like my wife has value. And if at any point my value is called into question because my wife somehow has more value than me because men suck, not interested at all, like not at all. And so I want my kids to have that, like, hey, look, when you go in the world, if people want to blame you and want to say you don't have value or that somehow who you are, white, male, heterosexual, homosexual, whatever, that somehow that's called into question as being problematic because it exists, you should be not interested. You should reject that and move on because that is somebody, and those are people who do not have your best interest at heart. They want power. They want to accrete social power, social ability, credibility, whatever it is, clout to themselves at your expense, and that's not worth your time. So stay away from those people and stay away from those ideas because they are fundamentally flawed. It doesn't matter which side of the coin they're. It doesn't matter if it's uber puritanical conservatism or puritanical liberalism. Those are people who do not have your interest at heart.
Yeah.
They have their interest at heart.
So you said something that you feel a lot of pressure, that there's a lot of messaging that men are the problem, men are the problem, men are the problem. They're doing these things. We're trying to correct them, right? Something that's kind of in my head, and I've seen a little bit of. I'm not gonna, it's
Sure.
nothing too crazy, and maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. But you'll tell little boys, "Hey, gentle hands, be gentle."
Right.
Some of it's just kind of innate, just maybe a little more aggression, a little more testosterone. I don't really know. I'm not a child psychologist. I'm just saying, like, let them be themselves, and they are going to just, like, you had 3 boys. Like, was your house a mess?
I was around lots of little boys and girls because my wife has a big family. You don't see a lot of girls building giant, like, tents out of couch cushions, or taking pillows and sliding down the steps, or making a pile of pillows and jumping down the steps and almost hitting the piano with their head. There aren't many little girls that do that, right? Little boys will find anything to do physically that's kind of like a little bananas. But we did not allow the kids to, like, run roughshod over. So we did not have a lot of broken stuff. No. We kind of tried to we tried to direct it, but we kept it in check. So it was just like we never came home and found a kid hanging from the chandelier.
Yeah, sure. You weren't raising wolves or monkeys, or maybe you were, but you had control of it. Well, I guess what I'm saying, Chris, is like kind of like, what would you say, or what are you concerned about in regards to the next generation of men that are being raised right now, that are boys?
So my concern primarily, and I'm hoping this is slowly being rectified. I think we're seeing in real time the rejection of sort of the identification of one group or another as the primary problem in society. I think that's being rejected by a generation of kids who can sort of see that it's not real. I would say that if you repeatedly tell a group of people that that the fault of humanity is this thing or this person, and you just keep saying that over and over and over and over and over again, the people that are that thing, and there are a lot of them will accept that. There are a lot of people, and there's a lot of white America that accepts the burden of guilt of past generations on themselves as being, oh my gosh, that's me. Like, I am a slaveholder. I am a person who persecutes women, or I am a person who doesn't allow for the fullness of humanity for these people. And they accept that. But there are a lot of other people over time who say, this doesn't feel like it's reality to me. I don't feel like I'm doing that. And so I think there's a rejection of those tropes that is happening in real time that's really positive. By the same token, you don't want to just say, hey, man, it's all, anything goes. Like, now that I know I'm not the problem, man, I'm going to go out there and get mine, right? And that's not what I'm saying in the least. It is that sex is important. It's important to you, and it's important to the other person. It's important to humanity. Children are important. Family is important. All these things are important. The circumstance for the majority of blacks is important to you as a white person. It doesn't mean that it's your fault that the majority of blacks live under you socioeconomically, but it is important, and it's something to take note of, and it's something that maybe you should try to help out somehow. But by the same token, there is a responsibility within that group of people, and you can't say, once you reach adulthood and you have multitudes of people, you can't simply say, no, there's no responsibility whatsoever. Nobody has responsibility over here because they were born into X. And it's like, I have a problem with that. I have a responsibility. I was born into a family in which my father and mother split up when I was a little kid, and I didn't have a dad around. I still have a responsibility to myself to teach my sons things that my dad didn't teach me, because I'm smart enough to understand what those things were. They're harder for me than some other guys, but they're important, right? Just like my mom taught me consideration, my dad didn't teach me responsibility, didn't teach me a hard, like, pounding the rock until you become hardened to it so that you can go out in the world and do things that are hard. It doesn't mean I don't owe a responsibility to my kids that, look, a tree fell down, we have to cut it up into firewood. All of us right now, all day. So I feel like there are changes happening in society, and that it's good that we are starting to understand that young men are not entirely at fault for there. At least there's a percentage of society that's saying, I'm not accepting that. Women are at fault. Men are at fault. We're all at fault. Women are at fault when they do things that don't make any sense, that hurt other people. So are men. That's just the way it is. And maybe men are at fault for different types of things than women, but they're all false. And the idea somehow or other that we have this proclivity that we have to find a villain, and then we have to create a one-dimensional character. We create a paper cutout of what that person is, and then we're going to vilify them endlessly, and then we're going to feel good about it. I'm like, I'm not interested in living that society, and that's been really hard for me because I feel like I live that every day. I feel like I don't say things I used to say to people who I'm friends with, just funny or just different things because, how is that going to be perceived? Is it going to be perceived that I'm somehow microaggressing, or I'm some other popular term that I'm doing that's, it's a very weird thing. Everybody, I think, walks around with a shield on, or not with a shield, with almost like an absorber. It's like a word absorber and a thought absorber. Like, hey, what did you mean by that? Whereas when I was a kid, it was sort of like, maybe it was too far the other direction. Maybe people didn't think which is bad. But now we're almost the opposite, where people are very, very ready to take offense and very ready to have a negative interaction with somebody else purely because of what their outside is, or purely because they come from this part of society or whatever. And so I fought against that with my kids. And I think, extraordinarily long way of saying this, I think that my kids are now much more able to deduce what the idea is when somebody comes to them with something that they find difficult to manage. When somebody comes at them with an idea that they disagree with, I think they're much more able to sort of confidently say, I reject that. Even if it's just internally, I reject that. That's not something I want to be a part of, and I'm not going to play that game. I'm not going to play the game of like who's right and who's wrong. And that's what I think I've been able to do as a parent and as a dad, and as a guy who's come to the conclusion that men are just as valuable as women, that I've been able to do for my sons. So they don't walk into the world and say, oh my God, this girl just blamed me for this thing, and I have no way of dealing with it.
Yeah. Let's go into that a little bit. Confidence, right? For me, that's what every parent wants, right? What do you actually want from your kids, right? Do you ever think about that? Like,
yeah,
okay, right. What's the goal, right? I want my kid to have confidence, and to be resilient, and to be empathetic. That's it, right? How do you build your kids' confidence?
But even empathetic is like, I want them to be empathetic, but I don't want them to be empathetic in an empty fashion. Like kids know, one of the things that psychologists talk about is that kids know when you're giving them idle praise. Oh my God, you tied your shoes. Oh my God, that's incredible. No, it's not. Every kid needs to learn. Now, it's great that you applaud them for making the effort and so forth. But idle praise is worse than no praise. Idle praise is, or it's equivalent to no praise, is seen through by kids as being this thing that, like, at some point or other, it's transactional. I can get something out of my parents because they praise me for doing something that that everybody else seems to know how to do. And that's kind of bad. And so, like, I want the empathy to be real, and I want it to be founded in something substantial, not in, I have empathy for that guy because he's fat. Okay, he's fat. I struggle with this. I struggle with seeing people that have privation and then imputing what their life must be like and being like, oh my God, that makes me feel unbelievably bad. I remember when I was a kid seeing somebody walk up a hill and they had some sort of a genetic disorder where walking up that hill was extraordinarily difficult. And I sat there and I cried about it. I was like 19. It was so upsetting to me to see this guy struggling to walk up a hill that would take him like 8 times as long as me. And that's valuable in terms of understanding something about that person, but it also is dangerous because maybe that empathy is misplaced. I'm not saying that guy didn't have a difficult time, but I know nothing about that guy other than I witnessed him struggling. That struggle might not be a big deal to that guy. Something else in his life might be a much bigger deal. But I struggle with I empathize with you, and oh my God, I feel so bad for that. And there are times when you have to measure that, where you have to say, maybe this is not this person's struggle. Maybe you would struggle with that, or there's a certain indulgence in empathy. You can indulge in that. You can wallow it and feel good about yourself. I'm a pretty good guy. I got upset when that guy fell down. And people really indulge in that sort of, it's a mildly narcissistic. So yes, empathy, yes, confidence, but like, just be careful. Confidence becomes arrogance very quickly. Empathy becomes self-virtue very quickly. All of these
Can you say that again? That was great.
Confidence can become arrogance, like in the flip of a coin, right? Between I'm confident about this And now I feel pretty damn good about myself because I can do it, right? That's a very easy thing to become. Empathy can become very empty, and it becomes sort of virtue laden. Like, oh man, I'm a really great guy because I feel empathy for all these people, right? That creates movements and all kinds of things that are maybe problematic. I value humility because humility is sort of difficult to get around. If you're humble and you feel humility before other people, the worst that happens is that you become a punching bag because you're humble. But you're not humble because you want to feel self-virtuous. You're not humble because you want to feel overly confident or arrogant. You're humble because you're humble. Like, that is a foundational thing to me that is more important than almost any other attribute that people can have. The difficulty with humility is oftentimes it doesn't lead to, I guess the biggest excess is that you can simply not do anything. I'm humble. I want to stay quiet and within myself. That's not a person that leads other people across the country and that die on the Donner Pass trying to get to California, right? The humble don't necessarily do that. But in most regards, I think humility is a really, really undervalued attribute. And it's part of parenting. What's more humble than deciding to bring people into the world, to have less money, to have less stuff, less time? That's a really humbling experience. Like what you did having a child. What is not humble is living big and showing everybody what you're doing. What is absolutely humble is having kids and working in a home to create a family that nobody else sees. There aren't cameras all over your house. You're not showing people what you're doing. And if you are, that's a problem. If you are projecting all of your vacations onto the world and Instagram or Facebook or whatever, like that's bad. If you're keeping it humble, you're staying inside your family and you're working with them and you're building something. So that's kind of my worldview on family and kids.
No, I like that humility. That's a good one. Do you think your kids are humble?
Yeah, I do. I mean, they'd be hard pressed not to be by how we've raised them. Maybe too humble. I mean, if I could be.
Well, how do you humble your kids without being like a total
you don't
dickhead?
You just don't. You demand things of them. You demand that they're responsible. You demand. You don't give false praise.
I like the false praise there because I'm noticing it with my daughter already. My daughter will do something that we're happy about. Mm-hmm. But she isn't necessarily happy about. And she will yell at my wife to stop. She'll be like, stop. My wife's like, what? Like, I'm being nice to you. I'm saying, like, good job coloring that picture. Right. We think, oh, we're just trying to, like, boost her confidence. But it sounds like it might be a little bit of what you said with the, was it false empathy? Is that what you called it?
Yeah, I mean,
not false,
it's not really. That's a different thing. Empathy is a different thing, but
that's not.
But it's
empathy.
Sort of false pride. It's sort of this. It's sort of this like recognition
false
that
praise.
Yeah, the recognition that what you're saying isn't. There's nothing really backing it up.
Yeah.
If I go and I do a half-assed job, and you're like, man, that I can tell you at work how I recognize this, and maybe you experience this. It's different as a gaffer than as an audio guy. I get praised a lot because what I do is really obvious to everybody. It's out there. People aren't listening to the audio, and people don't care, even though at the end of the day, if it's bad, it's really obvious. So if I light a job, and I'm lighting for somebody, and it's increasingly this case, that I'm lighting for people who have a less than a third the experience I have ever in the business, let alone running a set or shooting something or whatever. And I do it at the end of the day, they're like, man alive, God, it was awesome working with you. Like, I mean, it was like, man. And I've had that experience with a few people who are really good, who it's incredibly gratifying. Like it's amazingly humbling to have somebody who's really good tell you that your work is good. It's like awesome. But when it's somebody who I could teach how to do, almost anybody off the street how to do what they're doing in 2 years if I just kept working with them, then that praise is meaningless. I have more experience in the last 5 years than you do holding a camera, right? And I see that all the time. And so that praise it feels good, but it feels false. It's really kind of like, hey, that made me feel really good, but it's empty, and I know it's shallow. So it's like it feels good for a minute, but it's almost like a dopamine hit. It's not lasting. It doesn't tell me anything I didn't know about my capability because it's being told by somebody who has no idea what I did, really. They just think it looks pretty or it looks gritty or whatever. So like, your kid has the same thing where she's frustrated by, I meant to do this and this is what came out. And your reaction is like, oh my God, you picked up a crayon and you used it. And her reaction is, that's The using it really is not the thing. Staying in the lines was the thing. It doesn't look like a turtle. It looks like a flower. I didn't mean to draw a flower. You know what I mean?
Right.
And
But
so
she doesn't have those words yet. That's what we're trying to teach her, and it'll come.
But you understand the
yeah.
idea of the false praise.
Yeah. No, that's great.
And that, by the way, sets up to me a cascading effect. There's a great social psychologist and a family psychologist who lives not that far from here in Rockville, Maryland, who's written several books. He wrote a book called The Collapse of Parenting. And I think that's a brilliant, brilliant book. And part of the reason I think it's brilliant, I would say a filter device I use for whether a book about children is really good is if popular culture rejects it. Because I think popular culture is completely wrong-headed in how it views parents and family and all that. It's just they disdain anything that's traditional, that has any sort of like hard things, and popular culture loves the idea of whatever new idea somebody comes up with, and that's easy. So
it's easy.
That's simple.
That's the
easy.
other thing. Yeah, it's like
ease.
Typically, what I'm finding, and I think what any parent will find, and you might agree here, doing the more difficult thing is typically the better thing to
Absolutely.
do. In life and parenting, and doing the more difficult thing, getting up earlier, working out, doing things you don't want to do,
all of it,
saying no to your kid. Mm-hmm. Blah blah blah.
All of it's hard, and it really hurts inside sometimes. It's hard, it's difficult. Like being a parent and not allowing the television to be your kid's parent is tough. By the same token, I will say sometimes what I've learned is when I was a kid, being a parent didn't mean that you were there 24/7 for your kids' amusement when they're home, not away from school. Like, it's unfair to blame parents, and I'm guilty of this with myself. It's unfair to blame me, for me to blame myself for not making the perfect decisions with my kids, but also living in a world in which kids don't naturally run down the street and play basketball. Unless you live in certain communities, particularly like more working class communities and more rural communities, kids are much more oriented towards just doing whatever's easy, right? And whatever's easy and fun is like getting on a computer and playing video games. It's easy to be like, oh my God, I failed as a parent because I let my kids watch television and get on the computer. It's like, yeah, but by the same token, there weren't many kids out there. Like if you shoved your kid outside and said, hey, go play in the yard, it helps to have other kids play with them. And there are a lot of parents who just simply aren't capable or don't have the time or whatever to have their kids outside with like a Frisbee. And so it's a really hard thing. Like it's a hard thing to be. You can blame yourself very easily for your kids' failings in terms of what they do on a day-to-day basis. But you do have to recognize that we live in a totally different world. The world I lived in was, I'll see you in 4 hours. If anything goes wrong, come back and I'll hug you. But then I want you to go back out and do something, unless you want to help me bake or like clean the living room, right? That's a different world than we live in now. Now you are surrounded like, oh my God, my kid, I have to be involved at some point all throughout the day. And it's like, no, your kid has to be involved. Your kid has to figure out what to do and figure out things to do on her own without your involvement. Because if she doesn't, when she gets to be 15, she's going to be a nightmare. And so is my son, and so is everybody else's kid. Really important to let them be children, but also let them be children by themselves some of the time, so they can actually even if you're sitting up here and they're doing things and you're witnessing it, at least they're doing it by themselves, so that you're not like injecting yourself. That's why we have kids that go to, my mom was a kid, it was ballet class, piano, dance, right? But it was, you took your kid there, you did that, but then they ran around and did whatever they did, right? With us, it was Little League and all that stuff. My parents did not, and none of the parents before mine, sit around and wonder, like, how can I be a better parent today? Because they had less money and less time on their hands and less stuff to make everything work. They had to just do what they had to do, and their kids had to go over there and do what they're going to do. So when they get to be adults, they aren't brittle, right? They don't have to sit there and go like, oh, what am I going to do? Like, there's nothing to entertain me.
Yeah. Nobody wants a brittle kid. And
yeah. And Leonard Sachs, the reason why I bring him up is that he talks about...
What's his name?
Leonard Sachs, S-A-X. He's brilliant. And he's written, he's traveled all over the world. He's talked to kids and parents and teachers in schools in Norway, in Finland, in Japan, in Germany, in France, in Australia, in the U.S., all over. And he documents sort of the differences in ways in which kids in Japan react to things and handle things than kids in America, and kids in Poland, and kids in Norway. And it's not like they do it right, they do it wrong, but he documents things, and he talks about in his practice as a practitioner of family psychology for decades, he talks about the changes that have taken place since his practice in the 1980s, I want to say, to now. And what he notes is that there is a lack of moral authority that parents have with their kids. So parents are loath to tell their kids what to do or why to do something, or they feel like they have to explain everything to their kid instead of being like, no, I don't want you eating the peanut butter with your finger because I don't want you, it's gross. Don't do that. Everybody else has to eat from it. No, they've got to explain, well, or they just let them eat, like, oh, but he's exploring his own world with his finger in the peanut butter. This whole idea of like, gentle parenting, like, hey, he's exploring what it's like when you break a cup. Like, we should clean it up together and we'll learn from this. And what he would say to that is, what you're doing is you're building somebody who is testing boundaries and never finding them. Never. And kids desperately want boundaries. Just like kids don't want to move around the country. This idea that, hey, kids are super like there's a joke in Home Alone when the mom is in the back of the van with a polka band and John Candy's like, yeah, recently my uncle died and we were at the funeral home there with the kid and my 8-year-old and my wife and I got back home and we realized our kid wasn't there. Poor kid he was with a body for like 6 hours. He didn't talk for a few months, but kids are resilient. Like they learn from and it's like, yeah, that is hilarious, but it's not true that kids are super resilient and so you can just make them your plaything and include them in your social media and make them into little totems for you to like, no. So what he's saying is that if you have authority over your kids and you have a house where you and your wife are like the center, they don't pit you against each other because they know no means no. No doesn't mean I'm going to go talk to mom and mom's going to say yes. And then when they get to be friends with other people, no means if I go to Bobby's house and I'm not allowed to do this, I know that there's somebody behind me that says no, and there's a reason for it, and I believe them, and I love them, and they care about me. They show me love, and they show me responsibility. They show me punishment, and they show me caring. And so when Bobby's like, hey, let's do this thing we're not supposed to do, and I'm like, I don't think I want to do that, right? And that follows you for the rest of your life. So by the time you're a teenager, then I have a son, my eldest son, and all my kids are smart kids, but my eldest son is like freaking weird, crazy smart. My other kids don't hate him or disdain him or fear him or think like, man, I wish I was that kid. He worked really, really hard and he's really, really, really smart. That's great, whatever. But my biggest fear for him was when you get out in the world, you aren't going to be the smartest. Like statistically speaking, there are going to be 3% of the population that's smarter than you. So if you go to Harvard or MIT or Yale, what happens if all of those filter devices that happened all through your life, all that work you did, all the math and science Olympiads, all of the robotics programs, all these things that you did lead you to a place where you go to Harvard and you start studying engineering and you're not good enough? What happens then? See, what I think about you being smart has nothing to do with the reality of other people's version of what smart is. And if you're a room full of geniuses that are smarter than you, then that really, really sucks. And that's one of the things Leonard Sachs talks about. He interviewed a girl who went to Brown. She was from Baltimore. Everything was easy for her. Everything. Did really, really well. Great board scores, great grades. Went to Brown. She found herself in the bottom third of her class. And what that means is, at a place like Brown, you never catch up. They work so fast at the Ivies and these schools that you never catch up. If you're behind, you're done. Your semester is going to be unpleasant in that class, if not others. So she goes there and her bubble is burst her freshman year when she starts classes. And now in her major, she's behind everybody else. And she finishes that class with a poor grade. She ends up changing her major, graduating from Brown in a major that was much easier than the science major she decided to embark on. And in retrospect, realizes if she'd gone to Maryland, which she got into, and which has smart kids, but the Venn diagram, the overlap is slightly, the kids at the top of Brown barely exist at Maryland. That she's still smart and she's still gifted and able to do things. It's just that in that petri dish, she was failing. She wouldn't have failed and she could have made a fine engineer. She just couldn't have made an engineer that was going to succeed at this end of the pool. And I did not want that for my son. What if I'm wrong? Like, it's great. He talked to an astronaut. He talked to the guy, Reed, whatever his name is.
Pause for a sec. How do you do that, though? Because what if your kid is really smart and they get into a school? So are you saying like maybe?
I'm saying that your expectations that you need to, okay, you can't ultimately have your kid get into Harvard and then like do the work for them. But what you can do is make them understand that this is the end of the pool you're in. So if you came in third place in this thing that's across like 8 counties in Maryland, how many counties are there in the country? Thousands of counties. Okay, so let's just say the top 3 kids in those thousands of counties in this one area. That means there are thousands of kids that are smart as you. And of some of those, because you came in third, are smarter than you. So meter your expectations and understand that like really examine the relationships you have with other really smart people around you and sort of at least understand, am I here because I worked my ass off, or do I really truly seem to have something that other kids don't have, so that when I get into a situation where I'm taxed, I can handle it? Or I've done the legwork so that I'm prepared to make these sacrifices in time so that I can be successful. Like I can master something by taking a lot of time and doing it well. So you're right, you can't know. But at least your kid, if your kid is told all through her life, like, oh my God, you are the most amazing artist. Like, I mean, can you believe what she's doing? We all do it, right? Like, it's really good art. My niece does beautiful art. Is she capable of going to Cal Arts? No way. No, not capable. But she's a good artist. She hasn't, either it's innate or it's time that she hasn't spent preparing herself to go to Cal Arts where she'll be blown out of the water. I think my kid was actually prepared to go to Harvard without a difficulty. Would have been solid. Would have been a very good student at Harvard. Went to Georgetown, found it a little easy there, right? But he also still was taxed. There were classes that kicked him in the ass. I mean, there were classes where he's like, I've never worked as hard in anything in my life than this physics class. Okay, then you were probably in a really good area. Some of it was easy. Some of it was extremely taxing. You probably landed in a pretty good end of the pool for you. Okay, yeah, you could have gone to Cornell. Nobody really cares. And at least you didn't go to Cornell and find out that you got your ass kicked. I'm just saying that metering out expectations for kids means that when they get to something that's taxing, they don't fail. And what Leonard Sachs is saying is that this desire for your kids to be perfect and to be awesome and to tout that to everyone, and your kid knows that, they become a totem of your parents. They walk around holding a placard with your name on it and all your SAT scores and all that stuff, means that when they get into a hard situation, they don't know what to do about it, because all they've known is success and achievement their entire life. So when now they're faced with something really difficult, yeah, I was a really good boxer and I fought all these kids. Yeah, you fought kids in a little town. You went into a city and it was like, oh my God, I got my ass kicked. Your parents didn't prepare you for that because they just said you were awesome.
Yeah, it sounds like going back to humility.
Humility, and yes, that's the core of it to me, is humility. It's recognizing there are always going to be people that are, I've always said to my kids, there's going to be somebody faster, taller, better looking, smarter, and nicer than you. There's somebody who's going to be all of those things, within reason, versus you. So what? Just be who you are and try to be nicer. You can't be taller. You can't be better looking, but just try to be nicer. Be those things that are important and don't worry about the outward stuff. But recognize that there's always somebody. And it doesn't mean that humility means you don't try. It doesn't mean that you don't try to achieve. And simple people do amazing things. Very common people do unbelievably incredible things that guy who's great, smart, good-looking, tall, whatever, will never do. Doesn't matter. But have humility about yourself and about your surroundings. Recognize that you are part of a fabric of society and that you don't deserve more than somebody else. And you should also not be called to the carpet more than somebody else because you're those things. That guy doesn't deserve to be mistreated because he's good-looking, tall, or that woman. Just doesn't.
Yeah.
Work with what you have.
Yeah. I mean, that's all beautiful. Thanks for sharing all that, man. That's why I had you over here. Honestly.
Sorry it's so long. I really struggle with brevity.
No, I mean, but you're a great storyteller and great communicator, like I said in those text messages earlier.
Text messages? Just kidding.
The ones that were like, hey, Chris, where are you? Oh, sorry, I slept in.
The ones where I didn't show up because I slept.
Let's touch on one more thing and then wrap this up here. And I think you kind of have already talked about this, but in regards to connecting to your kids and staying connected, and now that you have 3 young adult men, it sounds like they like you. Or do they like you? Or I guess what I'm saying is, like, how do you keep that relationship strong? Because it's going to fracture and they're going to separate and do their own things.
I'm struggling with that now. So my youngest is a freshman in college. My middle son is a sophomore. My eldest graduated this past spring. It's hard for a couple of reasons. I'll give you this. in specific, my middle son and I have, I think, a lovely relationship. However, there are struggles with it, and I think the struggles are primarily my struggles, and they are that I expect too much, or I don't give him his own room for autonomy and showing me things he knows, because I want to prove to him sometimes that what he knows isn't maybe real. Like, hey, maybe you should think about it this way, instead of just accepting that he says, it could be something about, hey, what he learned in a class that he had, and something that he's read, and he's read and he's thought about it, and he's put it into his mental computer, and he's come out of the other side and said, this is what I know. And the reaction to that, especially with a young budding adult, should be, that's really fantastic. And if you're going to question it, you might want to say, have you thought about this and how it relates to that? It's something that my nephew, who you've talked to, Ben, would absolutely say is appropriate. You don't just blindly accept it, but you also don't pick holes in it. You sort of say, God, that's so cool that you've learned that. That's really interesting. What about this? Or how does this interrelate with that? If you have maybe criticisms about that thinking, like maybe that thinking is a little confused.
Do you have any examples, just to keep it simple? Do you have anything that's been recent? Or?
So if you and I were talking about Ukraine, and we've not talked about Ukraine, there's a very binary understanding of what Ukraine is and what the war is and what Putin is and what Zelensky is. Okay. That binary is a fiction. It's always a fiction. Everything is complicated and there's always complexity. We wouldn't talk about the nature of NATO and American relations with Ukraine and Russia and how we have abdicated our responsibility to something that we told, what's his face, in Russia in the mid-90s, which was, we are not going to, there's a red line in the sand and we're not going to go further than that with NATO. We're going to give you a buffer zone, and that buffer zone is Ukraine. And furthermore, we're going to stay out of the eastern former Soviet states because we understand that you need a buffer zone, just like we demanded of Russia that there's a buffer zone with Cuba, that you don't put missiles in Cuba. And if you do so, that's effectively an act of war. And we almost had a nuclear war because of it during the Kennedy administration. So over the decades, we've changed that. And we've increasingly impinged on Russia's autonomy and said, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. And the Western states have basically said, F you to Russia. This is what we're going to do. And if you don't like it, that's too bad, because we're good and you're bad. You're Russia. Well, that's a pretty dumb way to go about geopolitics. And so consequently, for better or for worse, a strong man goes and invades Ukraine, and we have this, that, and the other. Okay, well, understanding that background and understanding that, yes, Putin is a strong man and Putin is an ex-KGB officer and not a great guy, doesn't mean that the causation for the war is one-sided. So if my son came to me and said, based upon some reading he did, and a professor who has a particular bent on things, came to me and said, man, this whole thing with Putin, I mean, he's just a strong man, and Zelensky is this god among men, and it's amazing what he does, and he's out there as this just archetype of greatness, of a leadership. So my reaction to that could be, I think maybe you've drank from the wrong glass of Kool-Aid, and this is what's really going on. If I do that and I urinate, and my wife has pointed this out to me and said, you need not to do this. And I've looked at it and gone, oh my God, she's right. My reaction should be, God, that's really fascinating. There's so many facets to Ukraine. So what makes you believe that? What are they reading? And if I want him to learn more, maybe I say, hey, there's a thing that I read that not saying you have to believe it, but it might at least give you some more information about the war. That would be a positive way of handling it. Instead, oftentimes what I do is I've got to prove him that I'm right and that his take on this is wrong, which is as a young man with a father, that's where the rubber hits the road, right? It doesn't mean I'm blindly accepting. I still need to demand that he use his head as more than a hat rack. But I also can't be the guy that always bursts his bubble and be the guy who says, no, that's wrong. You can't always be the one to be like, yeah, it's great that you drew a turtle, but it's supposed to look like a flower, right? It doesn't mean that you praise and do that, oh my God, you learned about Ukraine. But I also need to recognize that as a young adult that he's going to feel a certain way about what he's learned, and that me peeing all over that is a terrible way to be. And it's a great way to lose a son and gain an enemy, right? Especially for a kid who's grown up in a world which says, remember, guys kind of suck. and they're kind of sexist, and people who might believe this way of thinking mean that this is who they are. If you are this way of thinking, it means that you're a socialist. It means if this way of thinking, that means that you're a Marxist, or that you're like a crazy right-wing whatever. And like, so trying to like maybe be a little more discerning with my critiques and be a little more accepting. And he's the one who I can see it in. The other two sons not a problem at all. We're kind of similar. And my middle son has that in him, that he's like, this is what I believe. And so I would say that I'm dealing with that right now, that how do you raise sons where when they come to adulthood, they don't just reject you. And my hope is that part of it is I alter that path, right? I fork in the road, and I take the one that leads me to someplace good with my son and not the one that leads to not having a relationship. And second of all, that I still want him to have to think through things and to use your brain, and to like, the demand is still there. Don't just blindly accept this because somebody that you think is great said it. Like, figure it out for yourself. Do some thinking. Do more thinking than the simple, like, this is the way life is.
Yeah. So it sounds like instead of just inserting your opinion and thoughts onto his, ask more about his thoughts and why he's thinking that way.
Yes, that's right.
Tell me more. And
then maybe have a discussion, or maybe down the line have a discussion, or maybe point him in a direction that says, hey, here's another way to think about this, from somebody who you think is worthy of respect and is not going to just, and understand what the triggers are, especially with young people. You want to present something which is rational and is non-judgmental, that doesn't just project disdain onto your version of reality or the people that you believe in version of reality, because then it's just rejected. And then the bigger issue beyond that is I'm facing my kids leaving, and that is very difficult for me. I want nothing more than having kids in my life, my entire life. Like, I want to have 15 kids, and I want them around me all the time. I want to live on a farm somewhere, and my kid has that farm and that farm and that farm, and maybe a couple of them leave, but we have this thing that we've built, so that I'm an active part of their social life, of the fabric of what they have. And I live in suburban America, and that's not reality, and that's a huge struggle for me, because my kids are not going to, in all likelihood, move out and then come back and live 10 minutes away. My one son lives almost an hour away in Bethesda. We talk sometimes, but he has a life, and he has a relationship, and he has things going on, and I really, really miss him. And that is extraordinarily difficult for me, because I know that's going to be the case with the other two. They're going to go to college, and if I'm lucky, they're going to stay in the region. They don't have any reason to leave particularly, but they might decide that they want to live in Germany, because we now are a society we're a giant diaspora amongst educated America. Educated America says you're not really fully fulfilled until you leave, and that's when you're fulfilled. Like, fulfillment is going over there and doing that cool thing. Like, I'm going to live in Paris, and I'm going to, because it's there on your phone all the time, and it's there on computers all the time. Like, oh man, that's real life, right? So like, everybody wants to be Hemingway, I'm going to go to Cuba, and I'm going to get in bar fights, and I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to go to cool restaurants and all that. And it's like, so my head is in like 1950s America in terms of how people are raised and then stay a part of each other's lives and their kids, and like, you want to stay around so that your mom and dad can help raise, when you have to work. I don't live in that world, and that's going to be a real struggle for me. So that's my biggest struggle is how do I go through the world being a dad who doesn't have any kids, in effect? My kids aren't a part of my everyday existence. Like, that's going to be and I don't know what to do about it. I am completely hamstrung by it. As somebody who intentionally maintained those relationships, doesn't have many strong friendships. Those friendships aren't even here. They're between an hour away and 2,500 miles away. That's hard, man.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go call my dad after this. Because, that in going back to, I think I asked you, did having kids change your relationship with your parents, right? I know for me it did. I was like,
that's cool.
Holy shit.
That's awesome. I
am this to you. I feel like you always love your kids more than they love you. Your kids love you, great. But I really do think there's always a sense of like, because you don't
Have you had your kid? Does your kid not hold you when something goes wrong and she runs to you and just
Oh my
you
God,
are
it's
her
the best.
everything? You are
Yes.
your children's sun and moon.
Okay, let me rephrase that. You have about 10 years.
Yeah, that's right.
That you are their everything.
Right, and then they have to not be your everything at some point.
But they're still your everything.
Right, that's right.
Maybe that's what I'm trying
Yeah.
to say. Is that like
as they age, they have to become independent. They have to become people.
Yeah, exactly.
And you have to revel in that personhood, but you lose them every step of the way. You lose a little piece of them.
It's tough. I remember, Jeff Atkinson, right?
Sure.
Yeah. He said something to me one time. I think my daughter was 2 at the time. We were at his like retirement party.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter's running around, just pure joy, the purest of little kid joy. You just And he's smiling at her. I'm looking at her. We're smiling. He looks at me. He's like, dude, it never ends. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, I can tell how much you care about her. He's like, my daughter's 27 years old and she's my best friend. I was just like, oh. Because
that's mind-blowing. That's awesome.
It's just like, and I think that's what you want. That's what every parent wants.
Absolutely.
And so a lot of this whole recording of this podcast is that's really what it's about. Figuring it out, talking to each other, and sharing what we think is important when it comes to family life.
I have to say that in terms of when I think about like the things that I've done wrong, which is more recent, it is like hyper involvement in your own little world that not so much work, but like I get inside my head a lot, and what it does is it causes me to be inaccessible, thinking about politics or thinking about like the world or just obsessing over things that are inside instead of outward. And so what it means is that I've not done what a lot of people have done where I've almost undeveloped myself in terms of hobbies and different things on the outside, which has made me less accessible and less likely. I would say with children, it's really important to maintain accessibility and to be open and outward so that as they go through life, not only are you a part of it, but they seek you out because they know that you're open to things and you're open to them and you're open to ideas and just open in general to them, to being in your existence. And that's also a different thing with boys and girls. The chances of me having girls that would be still close are different than boys. Boys tend to get super independent with their parents, and girls tend to not, which is interesting because boys are more dependent on girls than girls are on boys, which is sort of fascinating. But when it comes to parents, there's a reason why most marriages end up closer to the wife's family than the man's family. Even if they're physically the same distance, they're closer. That's a very normal thing. And so it's always a struggle if you're a man who has boys and wants to maintain that. I'd say the best thing you could do would be like, live on a ranch in Wyoming, and it'll come to fruition because you're around each other all the time and you are your relationship. Living in suburbia and in cities, it's much less so. I mean, your kids are they're naturally gonna want to seek greener pastures, and whether you're there or not, until they have kids, and then there's a good chance they come back. And I'm desperately hoping that I fought the good fight for why you should have kids, what they bring to you. And I'm really hoping that they have kids and then they're like, oh my God, I really want to be around my mom and dad to be a part of that and to help. Because it's a really hard battle, dude. Like, I'm living it. I can see it in my kids. They don't talk about it, but I can see that their idea of like what the world is going to be versus like being a parent as a primary thing and everything else is secondary, that they don't even think about that. It doesn't even occur to them. And that's with a family that's pretty tight-knit. Yeah.
Well, Chris, thanks for coming over, man. This has been great. I really enjoyed this conversation. I really hope
have me over.
Yeah. I think your kids are lucky to have you as a dad.
Here's hoping.
I'm assuming your wife is lucky to have you as a husband. Sounds like you guys are still.
Yeah, we're still trucking along.
Still trucking along. I mean,
I hope so.
Yeah. It's that is something that's another. We don't need to get into it, but that is. It's funny how it's like it's conditional love. Your kids,
Absolutely.
It's kind of unconditional, but
Sure.
so
That's very true, and that includes that all the dynamics there are complicated.
yeah.
Sure.
Well, maybe next time we can get into that, but yeah, thanks again for coming over, and
I appreciate it. I think what you're doing is awesome. I think this is good for people, for humanity to have. I hope people listen to you and whoever you have on, and they put it in their matrix and figure things out for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And
Leonard Sachs, don't forget Leonard Sachs. Fabulous
Sachs.
books.
Yeah, maybe I'll look him up and maybe have him over if he's local.
He's a fantastic guy.
Yeah, great. All right, well, keep me posted. I hope to see you on set soon.
Me too.
And
as we enter the new year.
Yeah, I hope this has helped you a little bit in regards to keeping connected to your kids. Like, you're kind of venting like, oh, I'm seeing these problems. So
it has done that.
There's always time for course correction.
Yep.
And we're always going to, because we're always going to mess up. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Yep. Maybe I shouldn't have given the false praise. Why do I keep calling it false praise?
It's false praise. And also recognizing that the more entrenched you become in any activity, the more difficult it is to get out of it. So getting out earlier is better. Making the effort to lose 20 pounds is almost infinitely easier than to lose 200 pounds. By the time you need to lose 200 pounds, the desire has been masked by all of those things that made that 200 pounds happen. And that's the case whether it's with sex or drugs or relationships with your kids or anger or whatever it is. The longer it goes, the harder it is. So do it earlier than later.
Start with the 1% changes.
Absolutely, because the 90% are really tough.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, man. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah, man.
I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. I'll see you around, all right?
Yeah, dude. Have a good day.
See you.
Bye.